I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. You know, a lot of people say that love makes the world go round, but that's false. In fact, what makes the world go round is cocaine. Stacy Herbert.
Max Keiser, yes, we're going to talk some torpedoes of truth today, because it turns out that much of what we think is A-rated or A-listed is actually collateralized by a whole bunch of Class A.
Wow.
First, we're going to talk about Charlie Sheen's Detroit disaster, booze, walkouts for the torpedo of truth. Or as one gentleman on YouTube put it, Charlie Sheen in Detroit, torpedo of
Well, that's quite a review.
Well, Charlie Sheen is the embodiment of the American dream. He thinks he's winning, he's really losing.
That's the key, isn't it? There's a delusion out there. There's a thought process that goes in the mind of the collective unconscious that everybody in the U.S. is winning. But in fact, if you look at some of the numbers and you look at how they're doing competitively around the world, they're actually losing. And like Charlie Sheen, many Americans have lost their job. Like Charlie Sheen, many Americans go on reality TV and make fools of themselves. And they're not winning. No, they are losing.
Well, Charlie Sheen was the highest paid actor in all of Hollywood, just as on Wall Street, Warren Buffett was the highest paid fund manager. Forget David Sokol. Is the SEC about to tell Charlie Munger to suck it in? Now remember, we covered this story. Charlie Munger is Warren Buffett's right-hand man. And now David Sokol, who is supposed to be the heir apparent to Warren Buffett, had to resign after it turned out that he could have been front-running or insider trading on Lubrizol, which he bought shares in this company prior to convincing Warren Buffett to buy a huge chunk of it. Well, David Sokol appeared on CNBC and said, "I don't believe I did anything wrong. Charlie Munger owned 3% of BYD before he asked me to look at it." Now, this is that Chinese car manufacturing of electric cars that Charlie Munger apparently owned before he convinced Warren Buffett to buy.
It's sad because Warren Buffett was really the last man in finance in America that had any moral authority whatsoever, the Oracle of Omaha. And he was constantly referenced as the quiet, studious, Graham Dodd following good guy who would come in and save Goldman Sachs, or before that it was Salomon Brothers. And it turns out he's just a conniving, backstabbing, inside trading, market manipulating schmuck like Dick Fuld or Jamie Dimon or Lloyd Blankfein or any of the other crooks on Wall Street. The fact that he's in Omaha doesn't make him any less of a Wall Street crook. And Charlie Munger, that guy needs to excuse himself from the public forum and just disappear for a while because he's a total embarrassment. I don't care how old the guy is. You put on your Depends and get out of Dodge because you're stinking up the joint, Charlie Munger. Get out of here!
David Sokol thinks that he will be able to get away with the same crimes that a guy like Charlie Munger can. But I think, remember, the law only applies selectively to certain people. Some guys are just totally exempt from them. And you see this in this following headline, Max, how a big U.S. bank laundered billions from Mexico's murderous drug gangs. So this is the Guardian News, and they've done a deep investigation into the story that we've covered before, which is Wachovia Bank. And they were found to have laundered $378 billion, or 30% of Mexico's GDP in this time, of drug money.
The cocaine.
Of cocaine, yes. $378 billion.
$378 billion laundered through Wachovia, which of course now is owned by Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway. And of course he's never talked about that either. And it's a huge part of the Mexican GDP. And the bank paid a fine.
Well, it's $378 billion in money laundering through the Casas de Cambio. And they paid a $110 million fine, or less than 2% of 1 year's profits from Wachovia. Wachovia is now owned by Wells Fargo. Warren Buffett owns 6.5% of it. But from this article, there's a very interesting point that I want to note that relates to this whole financial catastrophe. First of all, Wachovia started really getting involved in these Casa de Cambio in 2004, just when the violence really started getting extreme in the Mexican drug wars. In April and May of 2007, 3 years later, Wachovia, as a result of increasing interest and pressure from the U.S. Attorney General's office, began to close its relationship with some of the Casas de Cambio. And then in July of 2007, all of Wachovia's remaining 10 Mexican Casa de Cambio clients operating through London suddenly stopped, July 2007. What happened in August of 2007?
The world credit crunch.
The world credit crunch began.
So what we see here is that the global banking liquidity is funded from the Mexican cocaine drug cartels. When somebody decided to go after them, they withdrew their liquid cash, because remember, in the global economy, it's all credit and paper money. There's actually no cash except for the drug money. They took the drug money off the market, and they crashed the global economy. The reason Bear Stearns went bankrupt, the reason Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, is because the Mexican drug cartel withdrew their cash from the market as a protest against the investigation. In other words, so Wachovia, if I'm following this correctly, they had to pay a fine. No further investigation was pursued, presumably because if they went after this story deeper, the Mexican drug cartel would threaten to withdraw the money again and throw the global economy back into a total standstill?
Well, I think they learned their lesson, because let's go on to the next headline. The bank run we knew so little about. This is from the New York Times' Gretchen Morgenson. And she looked at the Federal Reserve Freedom of Information documents that were released only last week. This is based on the Bloomberg News efforts to force the Fed to release information that who they were loaning money to at the Fed's discount window. And it turns out, according to Gretchen Morgenson, in August 2007, as world financial markets were seizing up, domestic and foreign banks began lining up for cash from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That August 20th, Commerzbank of Germany borrowed $350 million at the Fed's discount window. 2 days later, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wachovia each received $500 million. Now, banks only go to the discount window when they're in serious crisis and they're facing a liquidity crunch. Thus began, Gretchen Morgenson says, the bank run that set off the financial crisis of 2008.
So, in retrospect, it was set off by Mexican drug gangs.
The ending of the money laundering via the banks. Without that access to liquid cash, they froze up, because it turns out, it appears that drug money was the only cash in the system. Americans don't have jobs. We only have debt. Brits only have debt. There is no cash. There's no liquidity. There's only crime.
All right, so we covered this story at the time, and we talked about this, and we said
We
that.
suspected it, yeah.
And we said that the crash of 2008, the only way that the wheels of global banking systems started turning again was that the money was released by the Mexican drug lords. But
Yes.
what we're saying today is that the reason why the crisis happened to begin with
Exactly, yeah.
was that with the withholding of the cash. And I remember, let me tell you something, Stacy. I remember just very vividly when I was working on Wall Street in the 1980s. Every Friday, we used to have cocktails on Park Avenue and watch this parade of limousines travel down Park Avenue into the basement of Citibank. Everyone knew this was money that was being laundered by Citibank from drug money. This was an open secret. Nobody doubted this. So I'm glad to see now, at least 20, 25 years later, people are beginning to understand that the global finance community, the global banking system runs entirely on cocaine money. So when they say, well, why is the war on drugs failing? Because they need the cash to run the banks. Why is the drug problem so rampant around the world? Because bankers need that money to pay their bonuses. The bankers, when we say bankers are terrorists and they kill people, and they have the moral equivalency of a Mexican drug lord lopping the head off a baby to support their crime syndicate, that's what we mean. They're the same. They're the same two faces of the same coin. They're terrorists. Blankfein, Diamond, Jose, whomever, drug lord, they're all terrorists. They all revolve around cocaine and money laundering, and now we know unequivocally, based on the Gretchen Morgenson's report and others, Wachovia Bank, of course, Warren Buffett's now involved with that. Who knows what Charlie Munger's habit is? The guy must be a horse.
At the time, up until July 2007, when money was circulating through the banking system from the Class A drug dealing. Those CDOs, backed by Wachovia Bank, JP Morgan, Bank of America, all these other banks that went the following month to the Fed. Prior to that, their CDOs may have been A-rated. Following that, all the downgrades happened. Now, we first reported on this in 2008 when Antonia Maria Costa, then head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, said he had evidence to suggest the proceeds from drugs and crime were the only liquid investment capital available to banks on the brink of collapse. He said, quote, interbank loans were funded by money that originated from the drugs trade. There were signs that some banks were rescued that way.
All right, and again, here's another aspect to it. Why do analysts give these CDOs a rating of AAA? Why does Moody's, S&P, Fitch give what is obviously garbage a AAA rating? Isn't it clear they're high on cocaine? Isn't it clear that people at Moody's, the executives at Moody's, Fitch, and S&P need to be in rehab immediately because they're taking massive quantities of cocaine to support their delusions?
Yeah, but Max, what it's suggesting now, that Wachovia has not been put in trouble. There's no criminal sentence. There's nothing but a tiny, 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 minute little fine, like pocket change. They're saying it's AAA rated now because Class A drugs are once again backing up the collateral that we're offering, the assets we're selling.
I guess this is again why the Federal Reserve doesn't want an audit. Because if you open up the vaults there at the Fed, whether it's the Fed in New York or the one in Washington, you're going to find Pablo Escobar sniffing 20 tons of blow.
Yeah, if you go sniffing around the Federal Reserve,
don't go sniffing around the Federal Reserve unless you've got,
Charlie Sheen type nostrils.
Charlie Sheen type nostrils. All right, well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for that investigative journalistic piece on the cocaine trade in Wachovia.
Thank you, Max.
Well, we'll be coming back with a lot more right after this, so don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to upstate New York and talk with author and blogger James Howard Kunstler. James, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. Nice to be with you.
Now, I believe you have a phrase, entropy made visible. What's that all about?
Entropy is that force in nature that drives us towards disorder and death and destruction. It's the second law of thermodynamics. And, what it basically means is that things run down. Your coffee cup never warms up more. It always just cools off. People don't go in the direction of being younger, they go in the direction of being older and passing away. Things don't get better when you use them, they break down.
All right, I guess this would also kind of play into what we're seeing globally with the Fukushima power plant destruction. There's been a collapse in this just-in-time supply chain inventory methodology, which when you take away one piece and entropy ensues and things suddenly get ugly. Does that fit in?
Yes, I think entropy is really the reason why things break down in the world. But I have a special pet theory about Japan these days. I think they're going to be going medieval. I think they're going to, at some point in the year or two ahead, they're going to decide, we've had the industrial adventure and we just can't do it anymore, because we have to import over 95% of our hydrocarbon fuels and energy, and we really aren't going to be able to do that. So let's go back to the 18th century. I think that's going to happen over there. I know it's kind of an out-of-the-box idea, but there you have it.
Well, it's an interesting thought. We've talked about on this show a lot about what we call neo-feudalism, where you've got modern societies breaking down and you've got the emergence of a kleptocracy who are pulling up the drawbridge. All the assets are inside the kleptocracy and everyone else is left outside of in the wilderness. So applied to Japan as a whole, is there enough of a vestige of society there to pick up on it? I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, but it seems like they have clung to many of their medieval traditions. Is there, just again, thinking out of the box, is there enough of a vestige there to build out? Could they conceivably go in this direction, James Howard Kunstler?
Well, I don't think we really know. They do have a very deep and fine culture. And it was kind of blasted away by this 200-year adventure, less than 200-year adventure in industrialism. And I'm not really sure that they have any choice anymore. You know, one of the things, speaking of feudalism, that I do believe we're going to see is there are going to be a lot of desperate people in the industrial nations who, really can't feed their families or can't make as much money as they did before, or are in some way or other finding themselves in desperate trouble. And I think what we will see is that they will sell their allegiance to some authority or person or group, in order to have security for food, shelter, and the basic necessities for life. And that's the essence of feudalism, when you're selling your allegiance to somebody for security.
Sure, I remember I used to live in the south of France in a town called Villefranche-sur-Mer. And this town got started something like 800 years ago by a local pirate arriving and selling people security, saying, let me pay a stipend to me every year, and I'll protect you from any forces that come about. So you see a return to this type of model, but broken down locally. So instead of, let's say, the U.S. being the world's global protectorate and extracting stipends from the world, the world has to pay its annual tribute to America in one form or another to keep them safe. As the U.S. collapses, the model is broken down, and we see more of a medieval model emerge. But let me ask you this about Japan for a second. The atomic energy industry, the plants in Japan, they're used to essentially boil water. That's what that whole atomic energy configuration is all about.
Yeah, to run turbines.
Right. Now, Japan, like Iceland, is sitting on huge geothermal resources. I read somewhere recently that the geothermal resources could do everything, supply as much power as the atomic energy industry can. Have you heard about this? Is that true? Is it practical? What are your thoughts on that?
There's no question that Japan is located on the Ring of Fire in their part of the Pacific, and there's a lot of volcanic activity and a lot of earthquake activity. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about that kind of energy is that you can actually run it down in a local sweet spot. And we also don't know what happens when you sink a lot of pipe into these fractures and places where the crust of the earth is disturbed. And, it may be that you can actually disturb it more by doing it.
Okay, you mentioned sticking pipes into the ground and not having a great idea how that all works. Now, to stop radiation from leaking from the Fukushima plant into the sea, TEPCO has deployed a few kilos of diaper absorbent. Now, it reminds me of the golf balls thrown into the Deepwater Horizon well during that catastrophe, that BP catastrophe. What are your thoughts on these, again, returning to medievalism, on these primitive methods of responding to these high-tech catastrophes?
People seem to do what they can. When people are desperate, they'll do strange and desperate things. So it's not surprising. They just can't, sop up that radioactive liquid or keep it from going into the sea or getting into the ground. So, they're doing what they can. Are they throwing Depends in there?
Yeah, they're throwing diapers and garbage and whatever they can get their hands on, like they did, the famous junk shot of the Deepwater drill. So here, it's very asymmetric in this way. They come up with these high-tech, brilliant, multi-quadrillion-dollar schemes to do deepwater drilling or have an atomic energy plant on the Ring of Fire, but nobody, or invade Iraq for that matter, but there's no contingency plan. If anything goes wrong, everyone's got their thumb up their schwing, and they're saying, well, we never thought anything could possibly go wrong. Let's throw some garbage at it. I mean, what is the mentality that where these politicians and engineers and everyone associated with this can't seem to ever imagine that anything they ever do fails?
The human race is kind of a comical species, and sometimes things don't work out for us. We like to think magically that everything is going to work just fine. Did you happen to see Mr. Obama's energy speech this week?
Give me the highlights.
Another example of our absolute inability to tell the truth to ourselves. We just are stuck in incredible magical thinking that there are huge undiscovered, unexplored areas of North America that we're going to get huge amounts of oil out of. It's complete nonsense. And by the way, Larry Kudlow got on TV last week and said we have 100 years worth of shale gas. and 300 years of shale gas. And President Obama said we have 100 years of shale gas. And both of those statements are completely untrue. We have probably about 4 to 6 years worth of shale gas energy at the rate that we use it, and maybe 12 years if you include all of the natural gas of any kind that we drill in North America. We have these crazy ideas that we're going to run an electric car fleet. Well, here's an interesting thing. Let's say by some miracle we ramped up an electric car fleet of 10 million electric cars in the USA, and that's really optimistic. We run over 200 million cars, okay? So what do you think is going to be the political upshot if only 10 million people get to drive and all the rest of them are paying through the nose for gasoline or can't even afford to own a car? Do you think there'll be any political repercussions of that? Because I do. Well, these are the kinds of things we're not even thinking about.
Well, Barack Obama is proving himself to be the Charlie Sheen of presidents. He's great on he's great on Twitter. He's got a great Twitter following, but when it comes to delivering, he's a catastrophe. All right. So you were recently quoted as saying that you believe that industrial farming will soon end. Okay, talk about this a little bit.
By industrial farming, I mean what we take to be the normal way of farming in America, which is, huge acreages with giant machines, a lot of diesel fuel, a lot of hydrocarbon-based soil amendments, herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers. We're going to get to a point where we're going to have trouble carrying that on. And, there's another part of the industrial farming picture that we don't think about at all. There's another main thing that we use, and that's capital. It takes a lot of borrowed money to run a big corn operation in the Midwest, and we're running out of capital. And the reason we're running out of capital is because there's a huge amount of borrowed money out there, or credit or debt, that isn't being paid back. And as that money is not paid back, the money vanishes from the system, and there's less and less money out there for people to, borrow to run their farms, or even to do other things like buy cars or buy houses on 30-year mortgages. So we're facing a tremendous capital shortage that's every bit as severe as our energy problem. And, I really don't think we understand how it fits into the picture.
All right, we got about a minute left. I want to talk about this a little bit more because it's very confusing for a lot of people. Because what you're describing is deflation. What you're describing is what happens when credit evaporates, when the ability to roll credit over evaporates and the credit simply disappears, and you have deflation, which is what's happening in the real estate market, which is what's driving Ben Bernanke to continue his quantitative easing and his quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4. But no matter how much of this credit he expands, it doesn't seem to be enough to cover the black hole of debt that's emerging, and the net result is deflation. But at the same time, you have rising energy and precious metals prices, which people point to and say, aha, that's inflation. And the disconnect comes between having a system that's run on a gold standard, where you could have inflation against something like gold, and a system that's purely fiat money based, where you have no collateral whatsoever underlying this in this economy. So we end up with what I think you would describe. I know you've described peak oil, and now you're talking about peak credit. And these two things are coterminous, correct? That's kind of the point, is it not, James Howard, Counselor?
Yeah, and I think there are two things that are going on right now with the debt situation. One is that we've used so many accounting tricks to hide the losses and hide the fact that the certificates in the vaults of the Federal Reserve and the big banks are worthless, that we can't even determine what debt is not being paid back. It's just not being recorded. And the other thing is that, as a general principle, when you introduce distortions into a system, you end up producing perverse behavior in that system. So right now, the perverse behavior is that the deflation just isn't being allowed to show up. And, we're seeing these distortions, like distortions in commodity prices and things like that. But, as this works out, I think that we're going to see a whole lot more deflation. And what that really boils down to is that nobody has any money when you have deflation. If you get into a hyperinflation event, which tends to be a very sudden kind of event that happens very quickly because people start spending money as fast as they get it, that's having a lot of money that isn't worth anything. So you can have a lot of money that's worthless, or you can have no money, but either way, you're broke.
Okay, James Howard Kunstler, thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
It's nice to be here by remote control.
Fantastic. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Howard Kunstler. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.